talk to me about localized ideology in the slave plantation. How does it speak to it? How does it speak to it? There's your example by Levine, but how does it speak to it? Yeah.
The master dictated the ideology.
Yeah, definitely. His rules, the structure, the structural forces that made up the plantation. But take me to the plantation itself. Then what did, if local ideologies are true, if what Ayers is saying is true, then what does the plantation actually look like and act like during that period of time? Ms. Malone.
Like the slaves in the plantation all had their own way of
Wow.
communicating, and
Wow.
they, I mean, coming from a place where they all have different languages, they had to come together and sort of like take from what the slaves, what the masters were saying and what they were saying, and come up with their own form to communicate and to survive, and just every form of agency. And for every plantation, it'll be different depending on where they're at in the South, like what they're doing and whatever.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what I want to hear, definitely. Or they all had to create their own forms of resiliency, which is what the course is ultimately grounded in, this concept of resiliency. So each plantation, just like each ghetto, excuse me, brother right there, right next to him, please wake him up. Right there, brother, come on now, hang in there with me now. It ain't that long. It ain't that long. Right? So each plantation, just like each ghetto, or each hood, or each inner city community, or each neighborhood within an inner city community, speaks to these notions of localized ideologies. As researchers, as investigators, as intellectuals of the street life-oriented black male identity or orientation, it is important to understand the way that that brother is thinking about everything, thinking about his space and his neighborhood. It's essential to actually reaching him and figuring out his condition. So definitely, I think that's one of the points that Ayers is trying to make. All right, popular crimes during the period of slavery. Keep in mind, slave crimes, right? And we'll read this in W.B. Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro when we turn to that. Slave crimes, he definitely argues it strongly, was hard to track, as we've mentioned. However, popular crimes that did exist, things you can be charged for, any event, fornication, you can charge for that. Adultery, you can be charged for that. Yeah.
But these are charges that can be brought on by the slaves?
By the slaves, as well as off of the slave plantation. But we're going to talk about the criminal justice system now on the slave plantation.
Doesn't fornication need to have intercourse under the command of somebody else?
No. To fornicate means to have sex without outside of the union of marriage. Adultery means to cheat on your husband or cheat within the context of marriage. So cheating was a big issue. All right? That big one that keeps coming up. That probably was the most heinous, horrible, crime that one could do. That was a felony times 13. Worse than murder, worse than murder, worse than homicide. It's perceived as worse than homicide. And violence, interpersonal violence. You could definitely get charged for that. Those are the big ones. Those are the big ones. Those are the big ones. But moving to the slave plantation. Let's go to the slave plantation. How did they do it on the plantation? Why? Because the slaves weren't allowed in the South, right? They're on the plantations, so they're not necessarily operating within the context of regular or normal or middle America or society. So as a result, they had to create their own rules. Criminal justice system, more specifically for the plantation. What's going on there? Anybody? What does Ayers argue? What's going on in that plantation? How are they treating each other? Anybody? No one, huh? On the plantation. On the plantation, again, we have 80% of the black populace in America at that time, particularly in the early to mid-1800s, 80% of the black populace is in the South on the slave plantations. Approximately 4 million slaves in the South. They weren't allowed to be incarcerated with white people, except for in extreme cases. The criminal justice system on the plantation for the slave generally operated in these three ways. Or these were the three forces. Criminal justice forces that regulated crime for the slave. The church, ad hoc form of the church, or a makeshift form, if you will, of the church, but the church, nonetheless, on the plantation, governed and ruled or evaluated criminal activity amongst the slaves. They could render a punishment that would be acknowledged by the plantation and or the slave master. So it was real. Whatever they said, whatever, particularly that preacher, that's why you want to get on his good side. It was real. The master, slaveholder, was generally the second course of action. So, slaveholder would say, okay, y'all figure it out. He did X, Y, and Z. Y'all figure it out amongst yourselves. And make sure punishment happens. If whatever was considered to be too much for this system to handle, then it would come to him and or his cronies. And then they actually did have local makeshift jails on the plantation. Probably look like medieval kinds of contraptions, right? Where leave you strung up overnight or maybe for 2 weeks straight, let the bugs and mosquitoes eat you. You know what I mean? It was crazy like that. Particularly if they got to rule. They got to rule. And they generally did that to the Nat Turners, if you will, for who they suspected and or who they actually caught were about to engage in some kind of revolt or rebellion. They would make definite examples out of those brothers. And obviously that can end up with being killed, being lynched, or capital punishment. And the third form, and the least form, with respect to a criminal justice system as it related to the slave, was the formal courts, or what we've been reading in terms of the penitentiary in the South. Now, there sometimes were extreme cases, very rare, where for whatever reason, these two systems were decided not to be adequate enough to judge the slave, and he was then rendered to the formal courts, and then he was incarcerated within that system. Again, very, very rare. Another thing to keep in mind is this. Most slave plantations, or all slave plantations, that's really what I should say. And there definitely is an argument that most, too, were not these huge 600-700 person plantations. Those were, some argue, a lot of people are arguing, few and far between. Also, all of them didn't experience the kind of heinous experiences, although I don't know what a good experience of slave plantation would be. But a lot of them didn't, for instance, for those of us who saw St. Topher, that didn't happen all the time. There was great range or variance with regard to plantations. So you had plantations that maybe had 20 or 30 people, or maybe less than that, right? And you have plantations, which we're reading in All God's Children, that may have had several hundred people, right? Slavery took place during this time also in the North. Places like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, especially in those spaces. Sometimes families they had really a form of indentured servitude, right? But it was real slavery. So in a place like Philadelphia, maybe they maybe have 2 or 3 slaves or servants in the house. And so keep in mind, it wasn't always the full, all-out, blown chattel slavery in the South with 500-600 people getting whipped by the overseer, even though that model definitely existed. Yes, Ms. Malone?
Didn't they have big plantations in New York, too? Didn't they find that, like, big slave burial in the middle of Manhattan?
Absolutely. Well, definitely. I mean, doing the project in Harlem right now. And definitely, early Manhattan was an agricultural land. I mean, it was just straight farmland. And right now, we identify it as an urban space. But that whole space was very, very owned by the stolen and owned by the folk in the Dutch. I was going to say how the Dutch, and then bought, really stolen, taken from the English, who would then eventually urbanize the space. But absolutely, there was a whole farming situation there. And, a huge black population, poor black population, which was called the Timberlands, which was in the 1700s. A lot of stuff went down there. And that was the first version of Harlem, and then eventually, and the Dutch actually gives the space Harlem. All God's Children actually talks about this, I believe. The beginning of Harlem and Dutch and all that. So, what we doing on time? I think, I got one, okay. Got a couple minutes, got a couple minutes. Okay. All right. So it was primarily though the church and the master, because slaves had no rights, their crimes were not real. Also, it was primarily the church that ruled. So these two forms, I mean, obviously this happened a lot too, but this definitely, particularly if you're reading heirs, this really was the master didn't want to be dealing with all of that. Y'all handle the situation. So he created a hierarchy on the plantation to regulate crime. Keep in mind, there was a rigid Protestant ethic, if you will. Protestant ethic-based notion, if you will, by the church. That is definitely how Ayers is describing it. The church oftentimes was very, very closed-minded, very rigid, tried to operate in favor of the plantation or the system. The church oftentimes, particularly if we're reading, excommunicated slaves from the church for breaking the rules. So in a number of instances, it may have been impossible for the slave or the hierarchy to remove the slave from the plantation, but they could remove them from the church, from practicing in the church, which was seen as the one of the few opportunities for them to somehow relish in some form of freedom or liberation or spiritual consciousness. So to be banned from that was a big deal. Excommunication, greatly embarrassed, shamed, impacted, or tarnished the respect or the reputation of the slave. So in addition to it being or infecting or impacting your connection, your relationship with God, but also can impact the relationship with others on the plantation. With respect to friends, with respect to women, in the case of a man, or marriage, or your children. Excommunication was a